What's up guys, Stefan here with Build the Lanes. Today we're launching a new video series where we check out and react to footage taken by cyclists around the country and study the different kinds of infrastructure in place to keep them safe. We will then review and also rate these kinds of infrastructure and figure out what can be done better in each case in the future. And with that, join me in checking out this footage taken in San Francisco of a man commuting from his home to work. Okay, as it currently is, this sidewalk is too narrow. If it's meant to accommodate pedestrians and cyclists at the same time, it should be widened so cyclists don't have to weave in and out of people walking. Also, we have a light post smack in the middle of the sidewalk, and that should be moved out of the way. This is exactly what happens when your sidewalk is too narrow in the first place. You're going to get tight passes and risky situations. This intersection doesn't have any kind of markings for cyclists at all. There's no bike signal, there's no kinds of striping. Then this is quite common, and the problem is that it leaves cyclists to operate in a bit of a gray area. It's not quite clear if they're pedestrians or vehicles, so often they'll use a crosswalk or they'll merge with oncoming traffic, and it adds a lot of confusion and unnecessary risk. We're seeing car traffic and cyclists being mixed, and whenever there's an accident that happens over 20 miles per hour with cyclists, the death rate goes up dramatically. So as a rule of thumb, cyclists and car traffic should never ever be combined at speeds above 20 miles per hour. That sidewalk is probably at least 15 feet wide. There's no reason there couldn't be a two-way cycle path right there and still have room for pedestrians. Intersections, without a doubt, are the most dangerous place on the road. That's where most of the crashes and fatalities happen. So when we have a cycle network, you really want to try to minimize the amount of times your network crosses intersections. Sharrows are really only meant for narrow, slow streets in residential areas where you see lots of cyclists and cars are almost like guests in the cyclist space. A lot of American cities misuse the symbol and they'll put them down in very high speed, high traffic areas. So this is really good. This is probably the first thing I've seen in this video so far I really like. Usually you want to try to disentangle bike traffic and car traffic as much as possible, and if there are different routes you can take to get to your destination, that's generally a good thing. Again, we go from a cyclist being in a completely different network, and now they're being dumped back into the street again. And you can see on the right that there's already a wide space available for the cyclist, where they would be completely separated from motor traffic. This is good. You have consistent coloring here. Green means bicycle. I think the city did the good thing here by making it clear to cars what space is theirs and what space isn't. When you don't have traffic backed up like this is when the situation starts to get riskier. So again, the preference would be that this facility would be completely separated from car traffic. When you have an on-street cycle lane, every time you have to go through an intersection, you have to behave like car traffic. If that facility was just on a sidewalk where there's plenty of space, you could just get around this intersection entirely and then all that risk would be removed. You should have some kind of rolled curb where it's much more forgiving, where it's not comfortable to ride over it, but you're not going to injure yourself if you're trying to get out of harm's way. Cycle lanes really, at a minimum, if they're one way, should be at least 5 feet wide. And this looks like it's around 4, and then a lot of cities often count the width of the gutter in that. It should be 5 feet without the width of the gutter, because that space is needed for one, just having a bit of buffer between the cars and the cyclists. And the second is that if a car does cut over, the cyclist has room to swerve around it. You always see the cycle lane on the left-hand side of parking on the traffic side, and then you have parking crossing the cycle lane. And this just creates a lot of unneeded conflict points. One, you have traffic merging to the right that wants to park. You have park traffic merging left that wants to travel. And then you also have the major risk of just being doored when people get out of their cars. What would make a lot more sense to me is that if you move the parking to the left and then you had the cycle lane go around on the right, you would get rid of all of those conflict points instead, and all the cyclists would have to do is go on a gentle curve. Sometimes cyclists are going to have to pass each other, and ideally you don't want them having to cut into the car lane to do that. So that's another reason why the cycle lane should be at least 5 foot wide as a minimum. This one's a bit more minor, but generally at intersections, again, it's a good thing to have a designated space for cyclists to cross. That way they're not weaving in and out of pedestrians and there's just less confusion over. This cycling network was approximately 22% disentangled. If you're not sure what that means, essentially this means that the cyclist was separated from traffic going above 20 miles per hour 22% of the time. So 78% of the time, the cyclist was exposed to traffic driving above 20 miles per hour. There were a total of 8 intersections that was crossed. We could count that there were a total of 16 cyclists, which gives us a rate of 1.9 cyclists per minute.